I want to throw up one last slide. I'm one of those people that believe that nobody remembers anything you say. They only remember how long you talk. So I'm going to go as quick as I can. This is one of my favorite. He's my personal historical hero, Fox Connor. Fox Connor, if you've never read anything about Fox Connor or studied him, he was a genius of warfare. But what he was the best at was he's the best leader developer that we've ever had in the United States Army. He mentored Patton, Eisenhower, Marshall. They called him the general. That's what they referred to him as. If he had not had a medical condition, President Roosevelt would have made him the Chief of Staff of the Army. He was passed over for Chief of Staff of the Army when they put General MacArthur in as Chief of Staff. He had 3 rules of war for democracy, and you got them up there. Never fight unless you have to, never fight alone, and never fight for long. The division that we have today in the United States Army was built by Fox Connor when he was the Chief of Operations for General Pershing in the American Expeditionary Force in 1917. We look at that war, World War I. I think it's very important, and the reason I do is because World War I. Most of us in this room grew up in a bipolar world. Cold War, Soviet Union, United States, democracy versus communism. That's what we grew up with. But World War I was close to, as much as anything else in our history, it was basically the apocalypse. It was a multipolar world. It was something that started very small and spun into a world conflict. And we had never seen anything the likes of it, and probably never will again. World War II was the second act. And so for this individual, it took him 18 months to really build the United States Army to where it could be beneficial to our allies in Europe. 18 months. We don't have 18 months. And we know that, and we're honest with ourselves. So with that, I'll take any questions. I think I got a couple minutes. Anybody have any questions for me?
Oh. Yes, sir. I'm going to start us off, and then anybody has a question in the room or any questions, bring them forward. Sir, obviously you're a student of history, and one of the questions we have in our writing contest is a question on what period of history you think best reflects the where we are today, and it might be multiple periods of history. But if you could, share what you think about that.
So I believe that I'll answer it in 2 parts. It depends on what you're interested in. I think history is kind of like wine. What kind of wine should you drink? Whatever kind you like. History is very important, but some people just aren't interested in it. Two places where I think if you like ancient history, I would study Genghis Khan. I see the future of warfare looking a lot like Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan killed so many people, the temperature of the earth dropped 2 degrees. That's the level of conflict that could happen. When I think of what could happen, I think of that. We're talking about chem bio, we're talking about a lot of other things. So that's one. The second is World War I, and it gets back to the multipolar world. We're talking about state actors, non-state actors, we're talking about peer, near peer, non-peer competitors, great power competition. It's all these things going on. It's 4D chess. It's not simple. It's not 1 against 2, 2 against 1, 1 against 1. It's not like that. It won't be Axis versus Allies. It'll be much more complicated than that. Already is. All right. Any other questions?
I got more, sir. That could get it. I got more questions.
Okay, good.
Sir, you talked about challenging assumptions. That was your first slide, or assumptions that we had about warfare and then what warfare could be. We all know that everywhere from the tactical to the strategic level in the militaries, you get down the road. At some point in time, you have to have a concept. You have to buy some equipment. How do we actively challenge our assumptions, things that we can't drive to fact, but still move forward in a way that has us ready for the world you just described?
Well, first of all, I think from a practical perspective, now I'm going to get into something that's not related to science, mad scientists necessarily, but one of the things that we're doing now is we're going to drive it before we buy it. That's one thing that's very, very critical. President Eisenhower talked to us a lot about the military-industrial complex and the challenges associated with that. And if you want to get into that, you can read some of his comments. But our ability to make sure that something works before we use it is really important. For those of us who've fired multiple rifles, the rifle that we have today in the United States Army is fantastic. It's extremely accurate. I would rather fire a rifle than a pistol. I would rather fire a rifle than a shotgun. I've grown up hunting my whole life. But that is a result of us putting feedback back into the mechanism and constantly getting better. I think that that's an example of what we have to be able to do, but we got to be able to do it faster, and we've got to be clear-eyed and open-throated discussion about what we are buying and what we're using. And we can't be tied to, we talk about partners and allies, we can't necessarily be tied to using those things that may just necessarily be NATO or things. We got to make hard decisions sometimes. I think the other piece of this, when we talk about challenging our assumptions, is looking for things that we agree with our enemies on. If you go back to the period around the turn of the century, the only time really in world history where there were two rising powers that had enormous possibilities from an empire almost perspective that did not go to war was Great Britain and the United States in the 1890s to 1910. That was a decision to work together. That's the type of leadership that we need right now. We think about how do we work together? What do we have in common? In great power competition, that's not something that we always talk about, but that's something I think about a lot in terms of challenging assumptions.
We have another question from the virtual.
Okay, thanks.
Sir, we have a question here. War will try to convince people to give up something. There's a lot of talk about robotics and between robotics. In the end, war will not end before someone has suffered enough. Any comments on that, sir?
I completely agree with that. War, and this is where that question, to me, really talks about the nature of war. So character war may change. You may use robotics or unmanned vehicles or hovercraft or jetpacks or whatever. But at the end of the day, if I want to make you submit, I come to your house, I knock on your door, and I make you kneel. We've been doing that for thousands of years. That's just the way it is. And so if I'm going to change a regime, I'm going to defeat an enemy. That's why defeat is so important. Defeating the enemy is really the outcome we want. That's how you get to prevent a fait accompli or other things. So I completely agree with the assumption in there that's embedded that it must be a defeat mechanism that is individual, human being to human being. A human being will make the decision to stop fighting. And I think that's the assumption that we really have to move forward on. Now, how do we get there? That's what we need help with. Okay? Okay, thanks.
We have something we're going to present you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so before you go,
Okay.
First off, thank you. It's great to get some new insights, and bringing your recency from the field is awesome. So you got us off to a great start. When we started this marketplace of ideas called Mad Scientists a few years ago, we had no idea how viral it would go, now literally worldwide. A lot of really famous people wanted to be proclaimed mad scientists because you can't just be a mad scientist, you have to be proclaimed. Right. So if you look to the chart, you can see some pretty big names, thought leaders across the national security space who are proclaimed mad scientists. So to thank you for getting us off to such a great start, we'd like to proclaim you as a Army mad scientist. And for those of you who've never been to a mad scientist before, we'll only read it once, and after we read it, you'll know why.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir, you ready? Proclamation, United States Army Mad Scientist. Whereas the Mad Scientist Initiative encourages continuous dialogue and collaboration among academia, industry, government, and non-traditional partners. And whereas the Mad Scientist Initiative identifies tomorrow's key innovations today, so the U.S. Army is successful in the future operational environment. And whereas the Mad Scientist Initiative supports Army learning and capability development. And whereas Brigadier General Miles Brown provided great and valuable insights and contributions to furthering the mission, goals, and understanding of the Mad Scientist Initiative. Now, therefore, by virtue of the authority vested in me as the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command Deputy Chief of Staff Intelligence, I do hereby proclaim that Brigadier General Miles Brown be known henceforth and forevermore as an official mad scientist, with all the rights and privileges pertaining thereto. May you always seek the future boldly, actively question conventional wisdom and assumptions, and passionately challenge the status quo. In witness whereof, I hereunder set my hand this 29th day of January 2020, Thomas F. Greco, Deputy Intelligence Senior Executive, TRADOC G2. Now, sir, you and Mr. Greco are the proclaimers, or the people that proclaim medicine in the future, but we would not allow you to sign your proclamation. Everybody who presents today will be proclaimed a mad scientist. It will have your signature and Mr. Greco's, but to make yours official, we didn't want to have your signature on it. That's too much power for one person.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Thanks very much. Thank you.
For your office.
Okay,
or you
great.
Can put it down and put your drink on it. This is dual use technology. And then also a miniature of our
Okay, thanks.
poster today.